Welcome back to the channel. My name's Vince. I'm a composer, and in this video I'd like to talk about the dry but necessary topic of project templates in the context of composing music using virtual instruments. This is something that is, a rather boring topic and something that can easily take up hours and hours of time just fiddling and setting things up and doing very non-creative, uninteresting things, but hopefully in the service of creating a setup for yourself where you can just use your DAW as a sketch pad, very similar to just sketching ideas on a bit of manuscript paper, just quickly getting ideas from your brain into your DAW with very little fuss and capturing ideas very quickly before you sort of lose track of them, assigning things to different instruments and doing all that as seamlessly and as frictionlessly as possible. There's something really nice about composing in a template environment when you've tuned it in a way that suits you, suits your workflow, and suits the kind of project or track that you're working on. It just means that you can focus all of your attention on the creative questions, on the musical decisions, and not get too bogged down in the boring bits of physically loading up different instruments, setting them up correctly, mapping your MIDI controllers, and all of that kind of boring stuff that you generally don't want to have to think about when you're in the world of ideas and creative flow. As somebody who was quite lazy and didn't set up any kind of templates, didn't really learn my keyboard shortcuts, didn't really set up any track presets or anything like that for many years even of professional composing, I resisted a lot of that stuff because that's just not what I was interested in or not what I was naturally that good at. I can say that having spent and invested a bit of initial time into getting these things set up, it's really accelerated my creative output in a really positive way. And also it's helped me take full advantage of the virtual instruments that I've purchased, certain patches and things that I might not really ever get to use by having all of the instruments quickly accessible and ready to go rather than buried in folders and file structures. It helps me to stay honest to my musical ideas by kind of going after certain musical sounds that might otherwise I might otherwise be tempted to not go after simply because the process of getting those set up and working is a little bit laborious. In this video, I'd like to go through sort of 5 levels of project templates, starting from the most basic to perhaps the most complicated in terms of setup, and just discussing the advantages of each. One thing that I want to say off the bat is that if you are just new to music production in general, don't get too bogged down by the kinds of things that I'm talking about in this video. So the first level would just be working with the default settings of your music software straight away. And yeah, nothing really much more to say about that, other than you might find that there are certain processes that you're doing over and over again that get a little bit boring or a bit laborious. If that's the case, then maybe move to the next level, which would be working with an empty project template. So here we are in Logic, and I've got my empty project template here. So the way that I set this up was just I created a new project, I tweaked some of the settings that I like, just loaded a few tracks, and then I hit Save as Template. I've got my empty project template here, and I can just double click that and everything's loaded as I like it. I have an audio track and a piano track. With the piano track, I have this purple icon selected, which just means that when I have other plugin windows open, there's only ever one plugin window visible at any one time, which just says visual clutter. I have a few other settings as well. The key concept to bear in mind is that in most DAWs you have global settings and project-specific settings. In this empty template, for example, the project settings include things like the sample rate. It also includes things like MIDI chase, which I always have set to selected on notes. That just means that when I play a note that's very long and it's a held note, for example on a string patch, and I play from the middle of that note, you still hear it. I also have, for example, in my piano roll, I have the secondary tool set to the velocity tool, which is just my preferred way of working. So little kind of quality of life things like that, whereas previously I would have to set that manually every time by selecting it from the menu. In this case, it's just set up and ready to go. So the key idea is any settings, any behaviors or preferences that I want to be the same every time, I just make sure that they're set up in my empty project template, and then whenever I'm starting a new track, they'll all be set and ready to go. The next level up from this would be to make use of saved patches or other methods of bringing in instruments, virtual instruments that are set up ready to go in the way that you like them. So the primary way when working with an empty project template that I would bring up a virtual instrument is by using my key command Shift-Y, which opens up the library and also selects the search field. It's called search patch, and then I can type in, for example, CSS violin 1 legato, and then I can just click that and it loads. And so that's going to bring up the instrument plugin itself, in this case hosted in Contact, as well as any other plugins on the channel. And then within the instrument patch itself, any settings that I want to put here, such as the mic positions or the mapping here. And then another way that I could bring in instruments into this empty project is by using the file browser, which I think by default is F. And I can browse to, say, a templates folder, say strings, and then that brings up all of the instruments that are in this Logic project. And I say I wanted just all of the SWAM series instruments. I could select those and check this thing here and then just click import. So this is a way of kind of having a bit of a modular project template setup. You can just load in groups of instruments very quickly by importing them from a separate project. The next level up from there would be to have some of your routing, some of your track stacks, if you like using track stacks, some of your stem groupings and things like that set up, but again in an empty template, in a way that you can then load individual instruments onto those channels but keep the routing intact. If I was more of a pop producer, I might create a track stack called vocals, and have that all color-coded, I don't know, red. And then I could have another one with some software instrument tracks that are going to be synths. This could become especially useful if I used external devices, external processors like physical hardware EQs. I could have all my routing for those kinds of things set up in advance. Another scenario that I could imagine being quite useful is if you work with a lot of orchestral sounds, having a lot of instrument tracks that are empty but labeled with the track names and color-coded and organized into different track stacks. That could be quite useful for just having everything be much more organized as you're writing music. Before I started working with templates generally, I would find myself wasting a lot of time scrolling through tracks trying to find the sound that I was trying to tweak. And so having just a bit of labeling, a bit of track organization done in advance can be really helpful. With all of the techniques that I've discussed so far, they have the big advantage of both loading very quickly because there's nothing really in them, but also, more importantly, they're keeping the creative possibilities wide open because you're not deciding in advance what sounds you're going to use. This point about keeping the creative options open is something that I just want to emphasize a little bit before we move on to our next example, which is more of a traditional template setup with tracks kind of preloaded and pre-organized. It's something that I've thought about a lot and something that's meant that I've resisted more traditional template-based workflows. I'm aware that every decision that I make in the creative process needs to be directly linked to my end goal, whether that's emotional or narrative or just my kind of vision for the track. And that includes things like instrument choice. And so, there is this double-edged sword when it comes to setting up templates and presets. On the one hand, you're creating a creative limitation, which can be very helpful and help you write more quickly and not kind of overthink things. But on the other hand, you are obviously limiting your options and biasing the creative process in favor of the things that are just set up and ready to go. Because if I've got certain sounds in my template, I'm more likely to just use them. I'm less likely to load a new instrument track manually and then maybe tweak the individual settings or find some obscure patch or even to kind of grab a physical instrument and play it in myself. So I need to be careful of the kind of biases that I'm building into my template in order to have the best chance of writing the best music possible. Obviously, the key thing with any template is that it's always going to be incomplete, both in the sense that I'm never going to have a template that contains every possible sound that I could possibly access because I just have far too many patches, but also in the sense that there's always going to be situations that require me to step outside of the template, step outside of my preset sounds, and just do things in a more manual or slower way, just because those are the sounds that are going to benefit the track the most. And the fact that something is easy to access is not necessarily a good reason for choosing it from a creative perspective. So the next stage is what you might properly call a template. And in this case, we've got my orchestral template here, which has all of these tracks in it. It's kind of a modest size template, I would say. In addition to having specific instrument patches, I've also got these sort of empty channels as well, which allows me to load something in on the fly, but keep the color coding, keep the routing, and keep its kind of location within this track list. I have each of these colors routed to a group, and the groups are down here. And so that also gives me quick control over the overall volume of that group and allows me to solo it if I want to just listen to the strings, for example. You'll notice I haven't got any plugins on here, and I don't have any plugins on the master. I've left the kind of mixing decisions open-ended again, so most of the tracks are in their default state, fairly neutral and able to be molded in the way that I want. So when it comes to these kinds of project templates, there are basically two reasons why I didn't go down this rabbit hole for a very long time. The first has to do with system resources, and the second has to do with visual clutter. And so I'll address the first point first. My assumption was that if you had a project template with this many tracks in, that it would immediately slow down your computer, and it would just be very inefficient because you have all of these tracks loaded that you're probably not even going to use. However, in recent years, this has changed for a couple of reasons. First of all, computers have gotten much better. The other thing is that in the more recent updates of Logic, you can load up a project like the one that I just showed you, and it doesn't load anything into the RAM until you actually start playing one of the instruments, and then it loads it in real time. And because computers these days are much better, the actual time that it takes to load the instrument into RAM and become playable is fairly minimal. So you can actually have lots of tracks there, and they're not doing anything, and they're not a hog on system resources until you actually start using them. One slight caveat is that if you are a fan of using track stacks, then sometimes you might find that you click on the top level of a track stack like this, and then Logic thinks that you want to play all of these instruments, so it kind of loads them all into RAM. One workaround to this would be to use the enable or disable tracks function. So if you right click a track here and go to track header components, you can find this on off button. And just selecting that will make these little icons appear, and you can have all of the tracks in your template disabled and then just enable them either by clicking the button, or you can assign a key command to that and just turn them on as required. And then regarding the second point about visual clutter, it was my assumption that if you had loads of tracks and you were trying to just create a song, you would probably end up with a lot of space between, say, a string part right up at the top of your session and a French horn part where you'd have to kind of scroll down. And if you wanted to like copy paste between those two tracks some of the same MIDI material, then you'd have to do a lot of scrolling. It would be harder to see what's going on in a track at any given time. You wouldn't get a very good overview of the MIDI material in your song. But that's also no longer the case, and the main reason for that is because, in the case of Logic anyway, we have a feature called hide empty tracks. So what this means is if I just quickly put in some pizzicato here, and then I put in, I don't know, some trumpet here, and then I hit a key command which is going to hide all of the empty tracks, then I can look at this. And that's immediately much easier to work with. If I want to add another instrument to the mix, what I could do is come out of that state, find the new instrument. If I just select it and then press that key command again, then it'll bring it into my selection of tracks here. So I can kind of toggle between seeing everything and just seeing the tracks that actually have data on them. In actual fact, there's an even better way to do this using an external third-party plugin called Plug Search. If I come out again into this view and hit a key command, then that brings up this track search function, and say I want a piano, I can just hit enter, and that immediately selects the piano track based on the track name. And then again, I can just press that hide all empty tracks again to return to this state. So to do hide all empty tracks, it's just this thing here in the key commands window, and you can assign that to whatever you like. So I've been using this orchestral template for quite some time, and what I've realized is that because there's no cost to having all of those tracks there, either in terms of the visual appearance or in terms of the amount of CPU and RAM usage, I quite like using it in situations even when I'm not writing an orchestral track, but I think I might just want a quick access to some string tracks or some brass tracks at some point in the process. However, one downside that I have noticed is that if you're somebody who uses a lot of contact instances, as I do, I use one contact instance per instrument, and often per articulation as well, that actually can have the effect of inflating the project template file size. Before I've even written a single note or added a single plugin, my file size is already about 300 megabytes, which seems very inefficient, and I'm not quite sure why it has to be that large. And then, of course, every time Logic creates a project backup, that also doubles the file size, so things can get quite large quite quickly. The other downside of this kind of workflow is that once you start to establish the track and there's a lot going on and you have a lot of instruments loaded, Logic's behavior can start to get a little bit laggy. It can start to slow down just because obviously the software is doing more and more the more instrument tracks are being triggered. And even things like just scrolling and zooming can become a little bit clunky. And so that leads me to the final kind of level of template organization that I've discovered so far. And that is having your virtual instruments hosted externally and then networking them into your DAW using a software called Vienna Ensemble Pro. So Vienna Ensemble Pro is something that I'm familiar with because back in the day, before I had a powerful Mac, I used to use a slave PC to host my virtual instruments, and then I used this software to route them into my Mac using the special host plugin. Basically, when I upgraded my Mac, it didn't seem like there was any reason to continue using Vienna Ensemble Pro, but there were actually two new pieces of information that I discovered that made me go down that rabbit hole again. The first is that it can be hosted locally, so there was this option of hosting my instruments outside of the DAW, even when using both of them on the same machine. And secondly, that Vienna Ensemble Pro also had this ability to only load samples as needed in the same way as the Logic orchestral template did, meaning that you can have your large template hosted on Vienna Ensemble Pro locally, but have it saved in a way where all of the samples are purged. And that way, when you're not using the instruments, it's not taking up any RAM. The nice thing about this setup is that there's, in theory, not much of a limit in terms of the number of tracks that I could have in my template, because I can just keep adding instruments to my server, and that's not going to affect the file size of my project template very much at all. The experience of using the DAW is generally much snappier, because it's not being bogged down by any processing or anything like that. If I want to work on multiple orchestral cues, then I can easily switch between Logic projects and keep the RAM loaded for all of the orchestral instruments that I've played so far. So closing and opening projects is very quick because it doesn't have to load it into the DAW. It's kind of staying loaded in the host software. It's fairly well known that using Logic with Vienna Ensemble Pro is not as smooth and as easy a kind of workflow as it is with some other DAWs. And specifically, I was having an issue with the negative track delay settings. I have unique delay settings here in the track inspector for pretty much all of my individual instruments, and that's a very important part of my workflow. And unfortunately, it isn't really possible to set individual negative track delay settings per MIDI channel when setting up Vienna Ensemble Pro. That's kind of a limitation of how Logic works as far as I can tell. And there are a couple of workarounds and plugins that supposedly can sort this issue out. I couldn't personally get any of these solutions to work for me. And the only workaround that I could think of was to have multiple Vienna Ensemble instances for each negative track delay settings, which would basically just mean a lot of the routing and organization of the samples would be quite convoluted and just a bit of a headache. So I was looking at the possibility of using another DAW, and in the end I went quite deep into setting this up in Cubase. So I'm just going to give you a quick fly through of my setup there. So the first thing I do is load my Vienna Ensemble server, and this is the thing that's going to host all of my virtual instruments. So I'm just going to open a new server project, and this will take a little while to load. It doesn't take that long. It's not loading the samples into RAM, as I mentioned before. It's just loading the different instances of Contact and other sample players. So when I timed this earlier, it took about 2 minutes and 4 seconds to load this entire server, which has all of the basic traditional orchestral instruments and articulations, pretty much the same as the Logic template that I showed you earlier. The idea is that I would load this at the start of the day, and then any other projects that I open which reference this server will be hopefully quite quick to load, because they don't have to load any of these instruments themselves. So here I've got different tabs, or instances as they're called, of Vienna Ensemble Pro with all of the various instruments. And so if I click here, you can see I've got a multi-instrument here with various violins. Essentially this communicates with Cubase. So here I've got my empty project template here, sort of similar to the one that I showed you in Logic. And then similarly, you can hide all the empty tracks by hitting a key command, and it just shows you the any tracks that have data on them. At this view, I can just use the track search functionality built into Cubase to locate an instrument, say a flute. Just hit enter, and there it is. Again, I could do the same for piano. There it is. And any of the instruments, as I say, that are hosted on VEP are not loaded into RAM until you start playing them. So these are all the MIDI tracks, and then here at the bottom I have the actual audio tracks where the audio from Vienna Ensemble Pro arrives, and these are linked to the MIDI tracks. So for example, on this, it's a MIDI track, but it's routed to an audio track that's down here somewhere in the keys folder, and that will appear on the left in this kind of inspector area here. So I can apply plugins to that, I can bounce it in place, I can do all my usual stuff. There's a very similar piano roll to Logic. I've set up all my key commands in Cubase to be basically the same as Logic, and more or less it can do everything that Logic can do, plus a few extra things. Obviously there's a few things that Logic can do better, but on the whole, so far my experience has been pretty easy coming over from Logic specifically. I think the kind of concepts and the design is similar enough that it's not too much of a challenge. Cubase is also very customizable, so if there isn't something that's set up in the same way as Logic, you can often make your own macro or use something called the logical editor, which is a sort of scripting thing here, which gives you access to all kinds of different parameters and things. The main difference is that essentially I think of my server as something that I don't really touch. Once it's set up with these instruments, these kind of templatized instruments, I just consider these as kind of locked. I have it set up in a way that's decoupled, meaning that the instrument data, the contact data, isn't going to be saved to my project. And so if I want to make something like a mic position change, well, first of all, I don't really do that very much anyway, and I've set the instruments up in a way that I like, or that is fairly neutral. But I guess I would have to probably load up an individual instance of that instrument and host that within Cubase if I wanted to really go into detail with changing the instrument settings and then have that be saved to the project. In every project, there's always going to be custom sounds, custom things that are just project specific, and so I just host those locally within Cubase. Hopefully all of these kinds of techniques are in service of just smoothing that process between having an idea of a sound and then having quick access to that sound and starting to play something in and getting the idea sort of into a more material form before you lose the idea. That's the concept anyway, and so that's why I've kind of gone in this direction. It's still at the early stages and I'm still fiddling around and learning Cubase, and we'll see whether or not it sticks, but in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Let me know if you have any questions or comments, and let me know how you like to use templates or presets in your own workflow. I'm always open to new ideas. And yeah, thank you very much. I'll see you on the next video.